Chris.
Hi, Kat.
So we're here in Senegal at the 2024 Deep Planning Indaba.
Yeah.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'm
Okay.
quite excited about
Okay.
the past 3 or so days. It's been really eventful. And really looking at the posters and the wonderful things that people are doing
Okay.
around African machine learning and African AI has been very, 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 very uplifting.
Okay.
And how are you?
I'm okay. I'm excited to be back with the entire community and just meet up with friends. It's a very chill Indaba for me because I'm not running around doing too much organizing. And I think
Oh, yeah,
this is ideal.
Yeah, that is true. You've been doing a lot of organizing. It's really good to, at least for once, attend. And although you're still doing some organizing here, right?
Just a little bit. So I know you have a workshop on Friday.
Yeah.
Will you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So our workshop is centered on, we call it Empowering African Voices. And what we're trying to do is, we're trying to take a different perspective on how we talk about the topics of AI and technology. Typically, when we talk about AI and technology, we focus on the models, we focus on the algorithms, we focus on the products. These are the nice things that people like to see. But we rarely talk about the humans behind AI. So what we said in this workshop was, okay, let's take a different turn and let's focus on the humans behind the AI. And then let's look at how to empower those humans. So when we say humans behind the AI, the humans behind AI just could be equal to data. You're looking at the data providers, the data creators, those who toil hard to annotate the data, to create the data. So we're looking at that community of people and figuring out, okay, how do we have conversations around that? What kind of conversations could we have? So conversations around how do you share your data? How do you make sure that the work you're doing, it's sustainable, so you could get some value from the work you're doing and be able to continue doing the work you're doing. So that's where licensing frameworks become very important, being very intentional about the licensing frameworks that you use, just being aware of the fact many data creators are not really aware about, like, there's a thing like data licenses that have impact on how your data is used. So yeah, this is generally what our workshop is going to look like. We're going to try to make it very, very hands-on, and not the typical, like, you come and just listen, someone is presenting, but more hands-on, drawing on the use cases of the participants.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know, maybe for a little context setting, we've been doing NLP research in Africa for a number of years now, maybe 4 coming on to 5 years. And because it's been largely in the research space, it's been very important for us to make everything open so that our research is replicable. So that it's replicable. But then we're now getting to this point where we're not the only ones who are interested in this work, right?
Yeah.
The world is realizing that there's value in building for African languages. And so we're seeing big players gaining an interest. And on one hand, that's great. But then also within the community, we're now starting to have a conversation about the fact that maybe it's not the best thing to make everything open, right? Because other people, external players gain an interest. All the resources are open. And they definitely have the power to take the resources and very easily start building products for us. Whereas I think we wanted this research to advance African languages and to then turn into products that we build for ourselves. So there's a pushback on funding that wants us to keep things open and just starting to think creatively about the fact that, yes, we're doing research and we want it to be replicable, but then we also want to I'll say empower innovators in our community to have an advantage when it comes to building. So I know you have been at the forefront of pushing back against these requirements of, everything being completely open. Are you open to sharing a particular project and some licensing choices that you're making?
I see.
And why?
Yes, with pleasure. The way I see it, I don't really see myself as pushing back. I see myself as redefining what we mean by open. Because like you said, we've been doing the frameworks of openness and everything. It came from software engineering and research, and the whole idea of, when you do research and you share with the world, it just helps move the whole field and move everything better. But now we're in a world where, first of all, there is commercial interest in that value that we're giving out in terms of the data. There's commercial interest. Commercial interest is a good thing, but I think where it becomes a bit dicey, why we need to rethink it, is because it's very easy to then turn into exploitation. Exploitation in the sense that you work hard to create something of value, and it's being used to make some organizations money, give them more value, and you're not getting anything. Anything means it doesn't have to be money, it doesn't have to be, it could be anything, but you're not getting anything. And the reason why it's important in the African context is because the people who work to make this data available are not, they have lives. They need to be able to sustain themselves.
Yeah.
If we draw a parallel to North America, most people who make software and make them open source, they have a well-to-do job. They have good means of income. They get their money. They're able to sustain themselves, and that's why they can now do the thing as a hobby. So it's really, for them, is a hobby, and it makes sense that when they do it, they say, okay, let's just make it open source, some Apache license or MIT, and just make everyone use it. But it's not the same experience. It's not the same way of living on the African continent. Many of the people who create this data are feeding hand to mouth, living below $1, and they are looking for economic opportunities. Many of them have the talents, and they're just looking for the opportunity. So if they then create this resource that brings value, and this value is being used to give value to another entity, I think it's only fair that we start thinking about how to, quid pro quo. It's the whole idea of, it's even the whole idea of business. It's like, okay, I give you value, you give me value. So it's only fair to start thinking, how do we give back to them? But many people, unfortunately, commercial entities don't think very hard about how to really give back to the data providing community. So this is why recently I found myself, as someone who is doing a lot of studies on modeling and algorithms, I found myself having to start trying to understand licensing and copyright and how to share things, to see if there's a way we can start trying out new ways of doing things that could maybe bring some change. And recently we worked on this project called Niger Voices, where we created quite large speech data set, about 1,800 hours of speech for the 3 Nigerian languages. It's a really large, very beautiful, impactful data set. And it was done by a community of people, 5,000 plus people to be exact. And these people are everyday stalkers, traders, pastors, churchgoers, students who are looking for jobs and looking for things to do. And then our community now said, okay, this is a large data set. It's going to bring value to people, and that's good. We want that. But we need to think about how to help our community so that they can create more data. And if they create more data, it would only help those who need the data. But we need to really take time and think about that. And so we started exploring different strategies of what we can do. And interestingly, it's not as hard as it's, because when I talk to people about, hey, why don't we think of something beyond just some open, just calling it open? Why don't we think of something more? They say, it's quite tricky, it's complicated. But we found that it's really not so tricky. It just requires spending some hours to really think about, okay, how can we do things differently? What ideas are out there? Taking use cases from from other domains, like in the music industry, the games industry. So how do these works of art sort of bring value back to the creators, and trying to take learnings from there? So we implemented that in the Niger Voices. And for me, what is important to me is I like commercial applications because they also help to improve the economy, they create jobs. What is interesting to me is not something that is like, I wouldn't want to do something that's toxic to the commercial applications. So wouldn't want to push them away. It's inviting them, like, yes, we can work together, but let's work on a on an equal ground. It's not, oh, you're down there doing some data for me. I take my data and give you some tokens and say bye-bye and I go. But let's try to have more conversations about what's happening with this data and where's our role and how can we fit in. Yeah, so trying to create that space.
Okay. I think one fear for me is that we get fixed and stuck in this box where we are the data builders and the data that we build is about ourselves, but we also make it an industry that is marketable for the people, but then don't put in further thought and build pathways for people to do more, I guess, higher level work or higher value work. Because at the end of the day, building the data is still, it's the very beginning, right? It's the bottom of the food chain. And I wish that we were doing more to, yes, build the data, but then also create pathways for people to grow and do more with the data for themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And then what do you think, like, what would that look like? Can you give me a concrete case study or example? It could be hypothetical, but what would that look like, creating the data, but allowing innovation from within that allows the people to do more for themselves?
I think supporting startups in the ecosystem is one clear way, I think, because these are the startups that are locally based. They're employing people in the area. They are registered locally and paying taxes locally. And I think that's some tangible stuff, as opposed to, a big tech that perhaps does not have local offices and still has access to the same data and poses competition to these startups such that they cannot thrive. But then also just in thinking about these communities that are building data, they're to some extent playing the role of archiving, right?
Yes.
They should be creating culturally relevant data that speaks about themselves. And I think part of bringing value to them beyond people being paid would be continuing to create this data, but then to also make it accessible in different forms. So not just for the purpose of training machine learning models, but then put it in museums in a manner such that the generations that come actually have a resource to learn about themselves and their communities as they are now, but then as they have been in the past. And fund that, whatever anthropology or archiving work that such that our communities can tell more stories about ourselves. I think that would be important.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that because even me, I must admit, when I think of like for the Niger Voices data, I remember a lot of the focus was on machine learning applications.
Yeah.
But yesterday when I was presenting a poster, a colleague, Dr. Ife, she asked me like, okay, did you also do IPA, it's just phonetic transcriptions of the thing beyond just orthographical? And I said, oh, no, we didn't actually even think about that. And when I talk with other, another linguist, like Samuel, it brings different things you can do with the data that I didn't even think about. So I like this idea of data sets are not just for machine learning. They could also be used for archiving the culture and for even for educational purposes, to teach the generation about the language. And having those other use cases in mind could also help, because it could also just a little change in the way you collect your data. Maybe just adding this could just make this data set be very useful to a lot more use cases.
So in thinking about linguists, I think we should be building more with linguists. We as technologists,
I couldn't agree more.
Because they're literally the language experts.
Yes.
And I feel like we sometimes walk in as technology experts and want to build language tools, but we don't consult the language experts as well.
I completely agree with you.
And I think that where computational linguistics, for example, is concerned, it's so to speak, the mother of NLP, right? As the field evolved, bigger data sets were built, research methods advanced, and then now we have NLP.
Yeah.
And in the excitement to build for NLP, we as African researchers are sort of focusing on what is comparable to research methods that are the state of the art now.
True.
And not putting so much focus on doing the groundwork that got the rest of the languages there.
Yes.
So I'll say that this is one pet peeve of mine. I would like us to do more with linguists and build tools for them to study our languages, you know?
I completely agree with you. That is very, very important. And it's a very interesting environment working with linguists because the ideas and where they're coming from, the ideas they bring are just fundamentally different to the way we think as technologists about things. I think technologists, we are trying to like, how do I get this? For us, it's like an optimization problem. How do I get this done in the quickest, easiest way? But linguists, I've seen, they make me really like bend down to really focus on the language and really look at the language deeper. And the data is not just a bunch of words anymore. It's something that's telling a story about the language structure and how things are connected.
Or the people and the culture of the day.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for as long as the language is in use, it is alive and it is evolving.
Yeah.
And actually, I meet a lot of linguists who want to do more study of African languages as they are used now, which is, I think, more contemporary use. So the code switching or the phenomena of maybe younger people having a variant of a language that is indecipherable to older people for one reason or another. And that's stuff that we could be building tools for linguists to study as opposed to being fixated on sort of automating them out of as much as we can.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, while there are some advantages to automation, especially from a product tools perspective, but at the same time, I think linguists will play a role in making sure that the automation is done well and not just blind automation where you're just employing some pre-existing method and just applying it blindly, but really looking at the language and seeing if things need to change in this method that you're using to adapt better to the language. So I was talking with Sam the other day and he's telling me about Yoruba and how when you join words together, like you see a word, but this is actually like two words standing together in the structure, and how some previous data set from the web, everything was joined and it was just wrongly done. And he noticed that and had to tell them, no, this should actually be redone. You have to actually separate this. And they went to confirm and say, okay, that's true. And then they started working together with some technologists to figure out how to sort of automate that process of probably cleaning the data. So I think linguists are very, very important to NLP. It's also important to make linguists aware of the roles that they play, because from my experience, I've seen that some linguists, they see this NLP and technology thing, and some of them don't see themselves playing a role there. So they say, okay, I'll just go back to my linguistic thing I'm doing and just keep doing it. So I think it also the bridge goes both ways. Creating awareness to the technologists, but also creating awareness to the linguists and creating more opportunities for these collaborations to happen. So I wanted to talk to you about building tools, language tools or language technology, basically the idea of tooling, right? Like we talked previously about building tools for African language technologies. So could you tell me more about some of the tools that you have in mind and how they will impact the field?
I think just going back to the fact that we're skipping the computational linguistics part and going to the more advanced machine learning and transfer learning methods, I'd really like to build the engineering tools for us to be able to do very basic pre-processing for our languages. So think of lemmatizers and stemmers and lists of stop words. That's stuff that's right now we just throw in the data and we say, hey, the machine will learn the patterns. But then in my opinion, that is tooling that on one hand enables linguists to do their work better. But then on the other hand, also enables us to study our languages and then start developing tools and architectures that mean we can develop machine learning methods that are specific for them.
I completely agree. I agree with you. And these tools that you talked about, like stop words and lemmatizers, these are things that this is a perfect place to actually collaborate with linguists.
Exactly.
It's really a perfect place to collaborate with linguists. As a matter of fact, there should be grants that are specifically tied to building these NLP toolkits, really specifically for the African languages. I think a lot of because of the whole hype of generative AI and LLMs, and I guess organizations don't want to feel that they're missing out. There's a lot of hype on this data-driven thing, just go amass data, and maybe too much reliance on large language models.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, just throw it in there, it'll fix it. And the large language models, we don't understand them. There's a stochastic process that we cannot even understand. But the tools that you're talking about, the toolkits, would help us really better understand the technologies that we're building on these things. Like I remember back in the day where machine translation or like sentiment classification, you had to first remove the stop words.
Yeah.
You had to then
get your bag of words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you're doing that, you can like, okay, what stop words are being removed actually? Okay, this is not a stop word for my language. It's actually a real word. Okay, let me put it back. And okay, you could follow the process, and you could look at what the model is doing, and then see your final outputs. But now you just throw it into an LLM and hope that some transfer learning will happen. There's need to really go back and revisit some of the strategies that we are following.
And in thinking about what nuances or knowledge about our languages we can leverage, something else I've been thinking about is mutual intelligibility. And the fact that speakers of related languages have a sense that, oh, your language sounds very much like mine, or it feels like I can understand you, except I don't. And those are definitely relationships that we should be leveraging and exploiting, and thinking about how we group languages and build for them in the context of transfer learning. So like a mutual intelligibility score metric or something like that would be really cool for us to build, and then starts letting inform how we strategize to build for groups of languages.
That is very true.
Yeah. And then the one thing I would mention is, we've spoken about this, the fact that there's a lot of interest in building for African languages, but then we're all still categorized in this box of low resource languages. But the truth is, between 2019 and now, there's been a lot of progress for some languages as opposed to others. But then we have no verifiable way of saying that this one has graduated from being low resource to maybe medium resource. But that's something that we should develop for ourselves. And like you were saying, a categorization that we define as opposed to letting the rest of the world define that.
I completely agree. And I think this defining the categories of languages, I think is actually very very important, because I notice a trend that's happening with the funding and the projects that are being poured out to create more data. People are focusing on just select languages. And I fear that, because we have 2,000 languages, I fear that if we just keep focusing on this few, you're going to still create the problem that we had in the first place, which is some languages have all the resources and others have none. So this knowing when things have graduated could also help with decision making. So when funds are being given, you can say, okay, no, let's focus on these languages and let's not focus so much on this because it's already graduated.
So I actually don't like this brute force approach that we use a lot of, okay, we want to build for 30 languages. What are the 30 most spoken languages on the continent?
That's very wrong.
I think we should do something much more balanced. If we have funding for 30 languages, what's 10 widely spoken ones? What's 10 at brink of extinction, and then what's in the middle, and then develop methodologies for different categorizations and documentation for other people to build upon that. You know?
I completely agree with you. It's very tiring to just see this brute force. It keeps being recycled and recycled. It's really sad. One of the projects that we're working on right now, we're trying to look at community data set creation with our data farmers, but across West Africa. And I remember one thing we did, which was very interesting, was we said, okay, what are the dialects, what are the languages that are spoken in these communities. We also started researching on Creole languages. What are the languages that are connected to the history of the country? Like, for example, the impact of Pidgin and Creole with the colonization and the first theory variation of how languages evolved. So, you bring in the colonial language, but that language evolves and morphs into something else that's being widely spoken. So I remember like the team going into that research to figure out the languages that to choose for the data creation. So we don't just go for, okay, what's the most spoken? Okay, Wolof, let's do Wolof. We say, no,
Yeah.
what's the least spoken one? Okay, and what's the one that has some connections to the community?
Yeah.
And so I think that's how it should be done. From the point of view of the people who choose the languages, I can understand why they go with just, okay, with 30 and stuff, because it's simple. And so I think this is where your tooling idea comes in, because when we build these tools, like something that says, okay, now this language is no longer low resource, we build these tools that they can go and sort of easily get this idea of, okay, here are languages to focus on, here are languages that you don't need to focus on. That could make their work easier, and that could actually make this kind of change that we're talking about.
Because then it could be what's high resource in this group and this group, and what's
Yes.
medium resource and what's low resource.
Yes.
And then we build resources to empower all the languages in the group at the same time, as opposed to
Yes.
thinking of them as individual
Yes.
entities. Yeah.
Yes, I completely agree. That is very interesting. And one thing I want to talk to you about tooling, because right now we're talking about openness and accessibility when it comes to data. And now we're saying we need to redefine how we think of open source. We need to think about the community. We need to think about the empowering innovations from the ecosystem. How do you see that playing with the tools? So when you build these tools, how do you see the sharing of these tools and making them available? Because they're going to be commercial applications. There might even be more external users of these tools than the internal ones.
Yeah.
So how do you see that playing around with the toolings?
To be honest, I don't know. Because it's software, it seems very easy to plug in open source onto them.
Yeah.
But then we still get back to these problems where the fact that these licenses and these frameworks don't address power imbalances. So
Yes.
I don't know how I can gate access, or how to think about gating access to certain communities. I don't know if this would be the right thing, or if it would be a blocker to overall progress. But to be honest, I don't know is the answer.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, because as I'm thinking that building these tools, I'm thinking it would also be nice to think about, like, if there are any repercussions to the way we
Yeah.
share them. There might not be any repercussion. Maybe it's just best to make everyone to be able to use it. Maybe that might actually be the true way to create sustainable impact. Or maybe there might be other ways to go around it. But these are interesting discussions. And then speaking of tools, I think one other tool of interest that I am thinking about is a tool to help people make decisions about the licenses that they choose. And I was also talking, I think the Dr. Chijoke, South African, Dr. Melissa from SIPI, they're also doing something like that, because they come from the legal side of things.
Yeah.
And it's about, because I think technologists and people like me, we don't really understand licenses and the impact of what they mean. That's why companies hire lawyers to help them also find loopholes and ways that they can use it to maximize their agenda, which is okay. But I think data creators, African data creators, we need programs, strategies to create more awareness about the licensing. Yesterday, there was the African data sets poster session, and I went and I looked around, and they're truly amazing posters. So many beautiful posters. Gideon went to his community and worked with his community to provide translation data sets of a few thousand sentences to do a machine translation. Teju Made built with her community data set of food pictures of food, and so many other, speech, so many data sets, and they were really beautiful. And I kept thinking, these are really beautiful data sets. And then I asked the questions like, okay, how do you plan to share the data? And what I quickly realized is that for most people, myself including in the past, the process of data creation always ends with I have my data and that's it, I publish it. We don't think about how are we sharing the data? Like what licenses are we using? Why are we using this license? So we just go with whatever is the default. And repositories, some of them use that to trick us. So a repository can tell you, oh, our default license is CC something, CC BY. And you're just like, okay, fine. But think, okay, what does that mean? Why am I doing that? Are there some other use cases? So for me, the way I term it is balancing accessibility and sustainability. I think data creators need to, and also this whole idea of I get a small funding, I create a small data, and that's it. I'm done. I go then work at Google or something, and hopefully someone 2 years later will get another funding, create a small data set, and that's done. But I feel like that will not create sustainable impact. You need something that can, on its own, be creating this knowledge and archiving this knowledge over time. And that's where sustainability comes in. So I think creators need to really put a lot of attention in how can we make this sustainable. And I think when you start thinking about sustainability, you think less about, oh, this is just a research project I'm going to do one time and that's it. And you think more about, okay, how can we make this ongoing? And that is where I think exploring licensing frameworks, exploring how to attend to commercial interests. I think that's where these conversations come in, and that could help in making very useful decisions about how you share your data.
What you described, I think, is of the result of where we're coming from. Because on one hand, incentives for researchers or academics has been citations, right?
True.
So it's valuable to build a data set and to publish it wherever. But then if it's a useful data set, you know that this is a steady stream of, citation, and therefore your academic profile is growing. On the other hand, where building data sets is concerned, I feel like in Africa, we are at risk of being left out or left behind. And so a lot of people do this work for sentimental reasons. It's because we want to see our languages represented,
Yes.
and that's the motivation.
Yes.
But we're definitely at the cusp of now starting to think critically about all the other things that come with it. And I think that time will tell, or things will evolve. Like we're having this conversation, the community is innovating, and it's definitely not going to look the same in another 5 years, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think with the efforts being made to create awareness and like these discussions. Also, our workshop is heavily focused on this idea of how are you sharing your data, and what are you, basically for me, it's like the thing after you've created your data, then what?
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about sustaining your community so you can create more data? And how are you thinking about sharing your data? I think there's more conversations about that. Like I was talking with Dr. Melissa, and she was bringing on her own ideas about it. And I was happy that the legal department is coming into into this space to talk about, okay, African resources. How can we make them better suitable with the licensing frameworks that we use? So I think there is going to be positive change in the next 5 years.
There is hope,
as you say. At the same time, inshallah. At the same time, we still have our work to do in terms of creating awareness, and I think taking the first step in sort of saying, let me try and do things differently. Let me try another way and see if it's going to work or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.